Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on Decentralized Manufacturing Regulations Update. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. You've joined the presentation listening using your computer's speaker system by default. If you would prefer to join over the telephone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions via Slido at www.slido.com using the event code #decentralizedmanufacturing. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. Please note that we will not be accepting questions via the GoToWebinar chat function. It is now my pleasure to introduce your first speaker, Ian Reese, Assessor, Standard and Compliance, MHRA. Ian?
Thank you very much for that, and welcome to everybody to the second webinar on decentralized manufacturing. So we had if we just advance one slide, please. Thank you. Thank you. So if we can just a brief recap, we had the first webinar at the end of January, and the principal aim here is to give you an update of activities since that time. This was the first webinar was one of the key milestones when the legislation was signed into UK law on the 23rd of January, and the first webinar was on the 27th. And we had a 6-month coming into effect period, so the 23rd of July, when this legislation actually starts to bite. And in that time, we've made good use of all the opportunities to develop technical and operational guidances, which I'll give a little bit of background and some of the updates, then my colleagues will join and give more detailed explanations. So thank you for that. So if we just move to the next slide so we can give you an outline of the agenda. So I'll give you a little bit of background, more as a recap really for those that are new to this topic and to MHRA's work in this, and just give an outline of the framework and give some updates. And then I'll hand over to my various colleagues that you see there to give you a bit more detail then on the technical and process guidance changes that we've made since then. We'll then have a Q&A session. These are more clarification type questions, and then I'll be back again at the end then to give you a brief summary. So if we move to the next slide, please, and the next one. So just a few slides then about the MHRA. You'll know who we are as the regulator of medicines, medical devices, and blood components for transfusion. Here we're focused on medicines and the manufacture by decentralized route. So the next slide, please. So you can see here our responsibilities, obviously ensuring that medicines or medical devices and blood components meet appropriate standards. And I'd like to focus really on a couple of boxes, the top right and the bottom right, where we're talking here about enabling innovation and collaboration with partners both in the UK and internationally. And I think this work that we're doing illustrates all of these quite well. And the next slide, please. So here again, we're focusing on the patients. It's very easy to forget that in the heat of assessment and inspections of the applications that we receive or the sites that we visit, that yes, it's an important activity, but it's part of a mechanism to get the right outcomes for patients. And what this does, this new framework, is to provide a broadened range of opportunities for manufacture and supply of medicines for patients. So the next slide, please. And one more, thank you. So one more click, thank you. So just as a reminder, some of you will know this. So the concept of decentralized manufacturing, which in the UK is made up of point of care manufacture and modular manufacturing, was really a consequence of receiving inquiries through our innovation office, the sort of early engagement forum at the MHRA, and then the scientific advice meetings to see what was actually going on and where the issues may be that were actionable, where the regulator could actually start to make some changes to keep up with advances. So an applied form of horizon scanning, if you will. And what we saw out of that then was a range of things which, while not prohibited by the current legislation, made them extremely difficult, very cumbersome, and almost prohibitory in some ways. So we then decided that, and we had a lot of informal discussions and some formal discussions with those in the UK and regulators internationally. And we decided that this was the course of action that we would take. And it's been quite a journey. I guess it's been 10 years to this date, so not quick, but the journey is continuing. This is just one milestone on those journeys. So the objectives then, and the next click on the slide, please, will show you that what we're trying to achieve is this broadened range of manufacturing and supply options. Clearly, it's important that the medicines made through this framework, point of care or modular, meet equivalent levels of quality, safety, and efficacy. And what we've tried to do is to just adapt the current framework with just what is needed to make the requirements suitable and proportionate for use by this route. We've also, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the legal tests that we've brought in, just to make sure that we minimize any duplication and confusion that could arise with a broadened scope of manufacturing and supply. And the other, which can be quite tricky, I think Niels Bohr said that making predictions, especially about the future, is very difficult. So I think I'm in good company there. But we're trying best we can to accommodate future developments. We certainly don't want to make changes to the legislation in the near future. And we've tried to strike a balance between having a sufficiently tight and coherent framework, but then all the guidance will contain the details, which are those things that can be flexed and adapted. And we certainly see what we've developed to date as version 1, and these will be updated with experience. And the next click, please. And so this is intended to apply right across the pharmaceutical range of dosage forms, from medical gases, blood and biotech, ATMPs, and small molecules. So it's agnostic about the type of dosage form. And the next slide, please. So just in terms of a brief recap on timing, and one more click, please. You can see that this, thank you. Yeah, so you could see here that we started quite some time ago, probably 2014-15, prior activities. The Innovation Office is the IO, and SAM is the Scientific Advice Meeting. So inquiries received there. We then developed some workshops to start refining the issues and what we needed to capture in legislation, and put a proposed framework together the following year in 2021, and then a public consultation with 4 questions. We published the response a year after that, and this coincided on the legal side with the Medicines and Medical Devices Act, which allowed the MHRA and the Veterinary Medicines Directorate to make changes to legislation. Then during the 2022 to 24, we prepared the legal documents and the other compulsory documents that go along with legal changes. That culminated in the statutory instrument, the SI, being laid towards the end of last year, and then that SI coming into law in 27th of January this year. And the next click, please. So then this year then has been focused since that came into law from that first webinar on the at the end of January, on the 27th of January, um, to develop the guidances, whether they're technical or operational. And key in that was a workshop, an in-person workshop on the 12th of March. So what the MHRA did was to develop draft documents, which we circulated then to workshop attendees and a few others for discussion during the day. So we had learnings on the day, and then there was a period of comment after the workshop. And that's what we then incorporated, where those comments were possible and feasible, into those guidance documents. And one more click, please. So then we're now at the situation where we have the website, the collection hub in place, where we've got all the documents, and then obviously today's webinar. So this is in time for the statutory instrument coming into effect on the 23rd of July. And one more click. And just to indicate that this has all been built on by engagement with a whole variety of different stakeholders, and including other UK and international regulators, and that continues. So next slide, please. So, and one click, please. Thank you very much. So this is largely what the current legislation has, both in the UK, Europe, and internationally. They're generally factory-based manufactured, usually scale up, so large scale for generally mass market, not necessarily, but there are obviously smaller ones, but we refer to that as centralized manufacturing. And in general, there are a relatively small number of manufacturing sites, typically somewhere between 1 and 5. So what this legislation is introducing, and the next click, please, is a spectrum to the right of that, which in the UK, as you move progressively away from the factory-based manufacture, we refer to as modular, sometimes referred to as pod or portable on demand by others. And so these are relocatable units that can go from one factory to another potentially, or to the vicinity of a hospital, or perhaps, and thanks here to Professor Wendy Phillips and her redistribution in healthcare products network, potentially military applications as well. As you move further away from modular manufacture, we have a range of the, or if you like, sub-elements of point of care manufacture. So mobile manufacture, so this would be akin perhaps to MRI units, mobile MRI units moving between hospitals for scanning. And so we saw a couple of applications there for ATMP type products being manufactured. Then further across again, we have the true point of care, which is where the concept started in the UK, where we had applications both intraoperatively, so you can see a little picture of a theatre there, on the ward, and again, potentially military applications. So some of these are what we saw early on were things that were very short shelf life products, and by very short shelf life, I mean between a half a minute and a minute. So then there is no alternative but to manufacture where the patient is, and so whether that's during surgery or on the ward. And so we'd seen some examples there. These were blood products for diabetic foot ulcer type treatment, where the manufacture would happen while the patient was under anaesthetic. And so the manufacture could potentially take 3/4 of an hour, but once it was finalized, then there was only between half a minute and a minute to actually apply the product. And so there you bring in the concepts of real-time release testing, although normally taken in a factory-based setting, we've adopted that because there is no alternative for those sort of products with such a short shelf life. So more on that later. Home-based manufacturing, this is an example of a product that was partially manufactured centrally to a stable intermediate stage, and then can be used then for treating, in the case we saw was cystic fibrosis patients for antibiotics, where the last stage, the formulation, if you will, was conducted in the patient's home, either by the patient themselves potentially or carers. This happened to fit in very nicely with the virtual wards concept of the NHS. So they would be managed clinically in that way, and then managed from a regulatory perspective through the decentralized manufacturing route. Some examples we've seen going back to modular, potentially quite a wide range. So here we have products that could be early stage pandemic vaccine manufactured by a scale out option potentially, and some others then that thinking of cancer immunotherapies where the manufacture and the preparation, the conditioning, or perhaps immunoablation of the patient have to be very, very closely aligned. And so we introduced legal tests for these two scenarios, point of care and modular. They are slightly different, and I'll just go on to explain those. And just one more click, please. So all of these are structured through a hub and spoke model. So we'll explain a little bit more about that. So there's a control site at the hub, and then all the different manufacturing sites are at the end of the spokes. And the control site is responsible for creating a master file, so which we'll just explain a little bit in a minute. So next slide, please. So this is just a visual of the hub and spoke model. So one more click, please. And so if you think of the control site as a manufacturing site without the manufacturing in it, so it has all the normal elements of a manufacturing site, or the quality system, the various different names, positions, responsible for doing audits, adverse event reporting. But here it'll be responsible as well for onboarding new sites and decommissioning sites that are no longer required. It'll be responsible for generating the master file, which in turn will support clinical trial authorizations and marketing authorizations. So what we did was in order to make this model feasible, and it's actually based on the European plasma master file system with a lot of adaptations, but we have used that and other regulatory examples we've borrowed with pride to adapt them into this mechanism. From an inspections perspective, certainly from a GMP perspective, routine inspections will be conducted of the control site as they would for any normal manufacturing site. And then a proportion of the remote manufacturing sites would then be inspected to verify that they were indeed under control. So that's the basic model. So a little bit more then, so next slide, please. So a little bit on point of care manufacturing. So these in general have a short shelf life. That's certainly what we've seen to date, but we're very aware that technology will move on, and so there may be other reasons for manufacturing at or very close to the site where the patient's located. So when we developed the legal test, we didn't fall into the trap of saying these products will have a short shelf life. What we came with a slightly more generalized definition was that they can only be manufactured. You can see those in italics there. So that allows for a little bit of future development where there may be other reasons, other compelling reasons why these products have to be made at or near to the where the patient's located. And you can see immediately that the patient isn't located in a classic manufacturing site. So there will be some novel and a very wide range of manufacturing locations. And we've just shown some pictures there, potentially intraoperative or on the ward mobile units. And we would therefore need to cater, for example, for units being moved around and how to track those, just as you do now for any manufacturing site. You'd need to know which room things were being manufactured, when they started, when they finished, and so on. So these are the equivalent type of details. And the next slide, please. So a little bit then on modular or pod, this portable on demand, and I guess this illustrates that there'll be quite a few different names, but as long as we understand what we mean, then it can be accommodated for, we hope, within this new framework. So again, this is a slightly broader category, and if you remember the picture, it's closer to factory-based manufacture. So these are essentially products that could be made in a factory, but the legislation, you'll see there in italics, these are manufactured for reasons relating to deployment. So this is usually a clinical or operational necessity. So the example I gave was, or the couple of examples, perhaps early stage pandemic vaccines, where the shelf life of the product hasn't been fully established, and they may have to be stored, as we saw in the last pandemic, for in quite challenging storage conditions. So this might help with future rollouts, or, and say, for situations where we have the cancer immunotherapy, for example, where you have to align manufacture and conditioning of the patient very closely. So next slide, please. So on the legislation, so this is the legislation, Statutory Instrument 2025-87, actually signed into law on the 23rd of January, just very conveniently ahead of our last webinar on the 27th of January. And so this sits on top of and amends the current human medicines regs and the clinical trial regulations as well. I mentioned that it had a 6-month coming into effect period, which is what we've been using to develop the guidances. And so that comes into effect the end of July, 23rd of July. And so in addition then to developing the guidance, they've obviously got to be available. So we created then a new decentralized manufacturing collection hub. So the next slide, please. So just some of the key elements of that. Next slide, thank you. So what we tried to do was to make this legislation, obviously changing legislation is not a trivial activity, so we wanted it to be enabling, enduring and proportionate, so fit for purpose for this type of framework. So a balance between provisions that are sufficiently high, so they're broadly applicable, but then balanced then with the details in guidance rather than the details in legislation, and then making changes to the current legislation to suit the needs of decentralized manufacturing. So next click, please. So one of the key things that we got back from the public consultation back in 2021 was to avoid undermining the current model of manufacture. Those were the words that were used, to avoid some confusion and duplication. And say, so we introduced then a legal test, which is for MHRA to determine. So we'll hear a little bit more in a while on what we now call the designation step. So the MHRA is to determine if those tests have been made, and these need to be at a suitable early stage of development before you go ahead to make a submission for a marketing authorization or a clinical trial application or a manufacturing application, to get that legal certainty from MHRA through the designation step. And then we just reiterate that point of care products can only be manufactured at or near the place where the products to be used are administered, and then for reasons of deployment for modular manufacture. So the next slide, please. And another click, please. So some things that we had to create. So because of the model, it's got a control site, which doesn't really exist at the moment. So we had to create a legal definition for that and say this is where, and we deliberately called it a control site because we wanted to control the sites of manufacture, as it would do anyway, but it also controls the creation of a master file. So it's a decentralized Manufacturing Master File, a DMMF, which you'll hear about shortly. So this is, in general, a detailed description of how you bring new sites on board, how you decommission them, how you control those sites to make sure that, in essence, what you have is mini clones of the different manufacturing sites, so that wherever the patients are, they get a consistent manufacture. Next click, please. So in order to simplify the situation, because potentially you could have not just, as mentioned, 1 or 5 sites as in the centralized model, but potentially 20, 30, maybe 100 or more sites. How do you actually manage that without forever coming to the MHRA for variations? So what we've done in the law is that this control site is the only site that will be named on the manufacturer's authorization, and then everything else then will be licensed via the master file. So when something goes into the active site, active place in the master file, that then allows it to be licensed in effect. And so a light is shone on that, and that then becomes a live site. When that's decommissioned, it moves then out of the active site. So that gives it, in effect, I suppose it's a kind of not quite do and tell, but it's something like that. So we use those sort of principles to add a bit of proportionality to it. And then the marketing authorization or clinical trial applications then are supported through the master file. One more click, please. And so there's no need to tell the MHRA when you bring on new sites or decommission sites in the normal course of the work of the decentralized model for your company. However, what we have put a caveat in is this thing called a material alteration. So clearly relocating the control site is a material alteration. So there will be examples also of other things. So if you go from maybe 5 sites to 50 sites, that would be a significant change. So a material alteration, so you need to notify at the time. As it stands, the notifications and updates to master files would typically be annual. So next slide, please. So one of the things that we have created, and you'll have seen this out for a couple of months, is a thing called a collection page. This is, in effect, is a one-stop shop for all things related to decentralized manufacturing. So there are links there to the legislation, to the guidance documents, which I'll just talk about in a second. Some descriptions of exemplar products, as I've outlined, and clearly the legislation hasn't come into effect yet, but once it comes into effect and we have suitable exemplars that we can anonymize and so on, we can then develop some case studies. Information such as previous webinars and so on will be there. Talk a little bit about the international work, but one example of that was through ICMRA and their report and a workshop from last December on decentralized manufacturing has recently been published, so there's links to that. Any other news and press releases will go there, and if you'd like to register to receive alerts, then please do so in the normal way. You can see there's a QR code there which will give you a quick link to that collection page. It'll also come out later in a week or two when the information on this webinar is published. It'll be available there, but it's fairly easily searchable as well. So next slide, please. So I mentioned the international work. So in the development of this framework, over several years, we've been working initially on a bilateral basis with other regulators, and it's been a pleasure to work with those, and we continue to work with those regulators just to develop concepts. And then there was an opportunity ahead of anybody bringing this framework into effect to actually have a workshop to try and align regulatory expectations. We fully recognise that innovators won't just be coming to the UK, but this will be an international effort, as it is with all pharmaceuticals. So ICRA, the International Coalition of Medicines Regulatory Agency, then put together through the Japanese regulator who coordinated this work through 2024, which led to a workshop in early December 24. You can see there were a large number of attendees from different regulatory authorities. And so there were three main streams of work: terminology and definitions led by US FDA, GXP technical aspects, which were led by MHRA, and then CMC, which were led by EMA. And then the fourth element, the publication, was led between Ireland and Health Canada. So, and then continuing that theme, then the MHRA Inspectorate is speaking at other regulatory fora, one of which is the PICS International Forum later this year. So, last slide from me, I think. So, next slide, please. Coming up. So, institutional readiness. So, this change is disruptive, it is different, and people sometimes talk somewhat glibly about disruptive change, but that usually means it doesn't fit. So you've got to make big changes. You can't just develop some more guidance. You've actually got to change the regulatory framework as well. You can't expand the guidance out beyond the legislative footprint. So if that needs to be expanded, that's got to be done first, and then the guidance documents have to follow. So in addition to all of that, the whole supply chain, very much like ATMPs, is different. And so you don't often manufacture medicines in somebody's home. Certainly it's not commonly done and intraoperatively in the theatre and so on. So there's a lot of other organizations that will have a key role in this. And so what MHRA has done and is continuing to do is to engage with those organizations. So key for this in the UK is the NHS, but we're working with other regulators, for example, the Human Tissues Authority, NICE, Care Quality Commission, and a whole range of others who may be regulating, like the Human Tissues Authority, part of this directly, but others won't be, and they need to be aware. So you can't, in a closely connected system like medicines manufacture and supply, you can't just make a change in one place and hope it trickles positively down. You've actually got to be involved. So this is something new for the medicines regulator, and it's been a pleasure working with those different organizations. And just to say that this was a concept, and there's a link there from a research council project that I was fortunate enough to be involved in a few years ago. So there's a link there. So at that point, I will hand over to my colleague, Elspeth Gray. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. So I want to look at in a little bit more detail the process for the designation step and the DMMF. So first, a recap. We've heard from Jan that under the regulatory framework for decentralized manufacture, we have two product types, point of care and modular. And this slide summarizes those definitions that sit within legislation. But what's key is that the MHRA has agreed that the product meets the relevant legislative test. So to qualify for manufacture at point of care, the rationale must reflect that the product can only be manufactured in close proximity to the patient. For modular manufacture, the regulatory test is broader and relates to reasons of deployment. And other examples could be pandemic response rollout, or that for clinical reasons, the window between the decision to treat and treatment delivery is necessarily short. And to boil this down, the rationale must be ultimately grounded in patient benefit that supports scale out rather than scale up. Arguments that solely relate to convenience or cost to the manufacturer would not meet those regulatory tests. So there must be elements that argue strongly for implementation of decentralized manufacture. Now, based upon feedback from the workshop, we've formalized a designation step to facilitate this. Next slide, please. So a rapid designation process is viewed as enabling, and this provides assurance of compliance with the legal tests prior to the company's implementation, with all of its demands on their resource and their time. So an application should be made with justification as to why the proposed product meets the relevant decentralized manufacture criterion, with a summary of the product background. The process uses an existing framework for scientific advice, and we will charge the relevant scientific advice fee. The designation process allows for further information or indeed a company meeting to be requested, and that's where the MHRA judges more clarity is necessary to support its decision making. The MHRA will provide its designation decision within 60 days if no additional information or meeting is required, or within 90 days should we require additional information and/or a meeting. Now, the MHRA will not publish information about individual positive or negative designations. Companies are, of course, at liberty to publish these decisions should they wish. The MHRA may publish general statistics regarding the number of positive designations awarded. Next slide, please. So now I would like to recap the DMMF, the Decentralized Manufacture Master File. So to enable the framework, a key mechanism is the DMMF, and what this offers is significant regulatory flexibilities, as you've heard. Now, it's essentially a document, and it captures product, process, and procedural aspects. Now, particularly for point-of-care products, aspects of the control strategy are likely to depend upon surrogate process parameters that have been shown to be quality critical, and thus an enhanced understanding of process and product characteristics will be expected. Now, where product aspects are already captured in the common technical document, which may be the case, for instance, for a marketing authorization application, the DMMF may simply cross-refer to this. The DMMF captures aspects such as the location and the status of manufacturing sites administered by the control site. And for a product that's the subject of a marketing authorization, this means that onboarding, controlling, and closing a site of manufacture therefore does not need to be notified by variation. And so, as such, it's very much a live document. Next slide, please. So, final considerations relating to the DMMF. It is specific to a single product, so it cannot be generic or general in nature. As it is a means to deliver regulatory flexibilities, it must be continually maintained and kept up to date. And annual reporting or submission to the regulator on request is required. I'll now pass to my colleague Martine Powell, who will cover some GMP aspects.
So good afternoon, everyone. What I'm going to do now is just go on to one of the specific areas of focus for the decentralized processing, which is the controls we're looking for manufacturing. This first slide I've got here is fairly similar to information we've published previously from the initial webinar and through the workshop that we held. And it's really looking at what we're looking for from manufacturing license holders to enable them to carry out either point of care or modular manufacturing processes. This new designation of point of care or modular manufacturing will need to be applied for by the companies to add it onto their specific site license. What we're looking for there is the nominated control site to update the license to name which types of product they're going to be carrying out manufacturing of via point of care or modular manufacturing. So it can be a variation to an existing license, the setup of a completely new control site operation under an existing license, or even a brand new license application. And this is going to be the same whether it's for commercial products under an MIA, clinical trial products under the MIA IMP licenses, or a specials unlicensed product under the MS license process. We're changing the application forms and the variation forms for those licenses to give a new specific type of application. So at the moment, there's examples of radiotherapy and different types of gene therapy products, that sort of example, where now there's going to be a new special requirement type, one for point of care and one for manufacturing. And you can select that per dosage form. So it might be you're only doing a point of care for small volume sterile, or it might be a semi-solid. So what we're looking for is sites to make an application to say, we want to do this new type of process for this type of product, and name that on the control site for that license. Any of these licenses that are submitted will trigger an inspection process. What we're going to be looking for there is the routine controls in place that are there today from the existing legislation, but then the additional systems and processes required to be supporting the decentralized processes. So some of these are looking at, well, how is the control site going to ensure that all the different spoke sites, these satellite sites, how are they making sure those are operating on the same way? How is the control site or the hub site going to ensure that the release activities at each of those individual manufacturing sites are going to be consistent, the process is the same? We're looking to see how a control site will ensure that the training of staff and the equipment used in operations at all the different sites are going to be the same or very mirror imaging each other. A lot of this detail that I've put here, and as we've been already talking about the DMMF, we've put this into guidance. So there's a guidance that goes over the aspects that Elspeth's just spoken about for the DMMF, and there's a separate guidance documents for GMP. What we're looking for from that as well is things like, how does the control site consider the approach to equipment and process qualification, the approach for personnel and training? How are they going to manage the DMMFs? Because they might have more than one, because you should have one for each product that you'll be interested in. You could start with one and then build up. And then how are you going to manage the annual submission process to make sure that these are reported? Those systems should be generic to say, how are you going to manage it across the board of managing this type of product? Then the specifics for each individual product can be defined in each individual DMMF. So that gives the oversight. Next slide, please. So within the GMP guidance document itself, we've broken it down into a number of different sections. And these really are the different types of topics that are coming up in it. So I'm not going to read through every bullet point here, but these are the types of things we're looking at. We've tried to give guidance on the different aspects that are going to be needed that are over and above the existing legislation, or different from rather than necessarily over and above. So they're written to support those specifics, and it doesn't repeat the current routine GMP requirements and oversight. So the details are aimed to support sites in preparing to handle those new DM products and the ongoing oversights. Now, as Jan said, we're going to be on a learning curve with you, so we haven't fixed everything down. We chose not to do that because we don't want to stifle the potential and how it might be applied in future for different types of products. And some things in reality, we'll need to see how it works, both for you as industry or sponsors or product owners, to those managing the treatment of people and patients, and ourselves as the agency, the regulatory body, to look at how the oversight is working. So whilst we're not going to change the guidance every week, I am expecting to get feedback from yourselves as people that are involved in this, and I'm going to get feedback myself and through my colleagues for when we're going out on inspections. So we'll work with the industry, with stakeholders, to say, where is it working? Where do we need to provide more information, without still saying it has to be this way, because we want to enable people to be able to take this forward in the way that works for them. Next slide, please. So we've already tried to do that a little bit, though, in terms of listening to stakeholders. So we've mentioned the workshop that happened. So we had a draft guidance document in place for the workshop, and that had a lot of discussions that were very valuable from that day, and we've had a lot of feedback since then. So we've tried to update the document that was in place at the time for that workshop to where it is now being published. So these are the types of things that we've looked at defining. So who owns the release processes? We've clarified that being the license holder QP or the named QC on a specials license. But would we necessarily expect that QP to be at each individual manufacturing site, each spoke? No. So what we've then needed to define is, well, how would we expect the releasing process to be managed? So we've tried to give an overview on how we would see a release for administration being managed for point of care products. So the responsible person is still going to be the QP or the named QC, but they might delegate that immediate release because it's potentially very short shelf life and the QP is not going to be boots on the ground in that area. So there's information in there. The key thing of that is that person who's carrying out the release must be independent from the manufacturing clinical teams. We've also said, well, what about out of specifications? What happens then? So we've put some detail in there, especially for ATMPs. The current system that's in place, for example, for out of spec ATMPs won't necessarily work for point of care because it's so immediate. So there's additional information in there for that. So those are some examples that we've put in. What we've not clarified, but is in place because it's actually within the legislation, is that the whole process of this point of care and decentralised processing is UK only. So some of the questions we've got is, can we have a point of care site, a hub site, a spoke site overseas? We haven't specifically put that in any of the documentation for GMP because this is UK legislation. So it's not currently applicable to any other nation. Other aspects, such as how the spoke sites will be chosen for inspection, again, we've not specifically called it out. It'll be assessed on a case-by-case basis, and we'll need to work with the licensed site, the control or hub site, to determine the practicality of going on site to see the individual active manufacturing at a spoke site. What I have done is included information within the guidance to update it to say, well, if we can't see a true patient batch being manufactured because the timing may not work for you or us, well, perhaps then we'll look at managing a viewing of a simulation run or a training run so that we can see how things are being handled. But every time with something like that, we'll be working with the licensed site, the hub control site, to say, how is that going to work? Again, some aspects haven't been called out because they're routine. So, for example, inspection frequency is not mentioned. It will follow the current risk-based inspection approach. When it's brand new, when it's something different, the inspection frequency is increased where we can, simply because we want to see how it beds in. But that doesn't mean we think that the risk is higher, so we'll always assess it on a risk-based approach. So that's a very quick run through some of the GMP guidance that we've put together. I'm hoping that the information that we've published through the website, the page that Jan mentioned, will give you more information. We recognise there will still be more questions. I can see there's quite a few coming in through Slido. So we're open to that, and we'll be working with stakeholders going forwards. So thank you for that. What I'm now going to do is hand over to my colleague Claire for some pharmacovigilance work.
Thank you very much, Martine, and good afternoon to everybody. So I'm going to be taking pharmacovigilance considerations, as Martine said, and there are various pharmacovigilance considerations related to decentralised manufacture products, which we've included in the guidance. And we've put guidance out for authorised products, specials and EAMS in relation to pharmacovigilance. So that's our early access to medicine scheme. And the reason for the specific considerations that are required in respect to PV for decentralised manufactured products is due to that manufacturing variability that may be associated with these products and due to the number of sites that will be manufacturing. And therefore, the product traceability is a key requirement for pharmacovigilance for these products to ensure that sites can be readily distinguishable, to enable newly emerging and product safety concerns to be rapidly detected and evaluated. So I'm going to start with this first slide with the authorised products. And firstly, it's important to say that the good vigilance practice modules, which stipulate all of the guidance for pharmacovigilance, and that is statutory guidance, and the exceptions and modifications document, which is published by the MHRA, are still applicable to all of these products. And the guidance that we've published for decentralised manufactured products is to support these modules and is additional points to consider over and above the requirements laid out in the GVP modules. So starting, as I said, with the authorised products, in terms of risk management systems, you will have to have a risk management plan for all of your UK authorised products, as you do with any UK authorised products authorised after July 2012. And there are a few additional considerations that will need to happen with these type of products. And that will be a discussion of the healthcare setting that the product will be used in, within the pharmacovigilance plan, within the RMP, along with additional activities that may support traceability of adverse drug reactions to the product batch and manufacturing sites. And where you are required to have additional risk minimisation measures, the plans for the dissemination of the appropriate risk minimisation tools should be appropriate to the decentralised manufacture. And the plans for the dissemination should consider engaging manufacturer control sites to support the flow of dissemination through the process to the relevant recipients. Moving on to the management and reporting of adverse events. Sort of the key aspect here is that there is the requirement to continue to submit any adverse reactions as you would for all of the UK authorised products to the MHRA, but here you will have the additional need to report the batch number or other product identifier, and that has been updated in line with Regulation 188 of the Human Medicines Regulation. They need to continue to be reported in line with our current 15 and 90-day timeframes, but you need to make sure that you have those provisions in place that you can collect the batch number and product identifier in order for those to be reported. So you need to give encouragement to the healthcare professionals or the patients and carers to report those batch numbers, and equally if those batch numbers aren't provided, when those adverse events are reported, you need to have the follow-up provisions in place to be able to capture that information. Regarding the evaluation of safety data, there are some specific considerations for the periodic safety update reports or PSURs, which will include things like exposure data, as that will need to be stratified according to the manufacturing site. But mostly the impact here is to signal evaluation. And with all products, for decentralised manufacture as well, they will require continuous pharmacovigilance in order to detect and evaluate potential new risks that may emerge within the product's life cycle. But it's additionally important for decentralised manufactured products for the reasons that I described when I started around the manufacturing variability, that you're also looking not just at a active substance level, but also at a site level for those adverse events and being able to detect that. So the frequency of the signal detection also needs to be thought about in terms of the time frame that that's conducted, and the intervals between each signal detection activity need to be short enough to identify any serious safety concerns at that manufacturing site level. And you'll need to think about bringing in that product quality information. And although that's something that we have to do anyway, it's particularly important here if there is something from a product quality side where there has been a deviation at a particular site. It may be that the safety team needs to have a bit more scrutiny in that area when they're performing their signal detection activities. And then lastly, moving on to the quality management system, there's a few aspects which need to be considered here. A lot of those are around the provisions that you have in place to collect and collate that safety information for your decentralized manufactured medicines, and ensuring that the flow of information from the site to the control site to the safety department flows as it should, and therefore you need to consider whether you need any contracts and agreements to support that, any additional SOPs, for instance. And then, do you need any oversight mechanisms? These may be sort of ongoing oversight mechanisms for such as reconciliation to make sure those adverse events have been reported to safety, or more ad hoc measures such as audit, so making sure that you're capturing everybody that you need to into your audit scopes and audit risk assessments. And where an issue or a deviation for pharmacovigilance is identified for one of these types of medicines, if it is a particular site, further investigations should be undertaken to understand whether that's an isolated issue or something that affects multiple sites. And then finally, around the QPPV and the PSMF, with the UK QPPV, they need to be aware if your organisation is expanding its product portfolio with the addition of any decentralised manufactured products, and the qualified person for pharmacovigilance, the QPPV, should be notified as early as possible so that they can assess the potential impact on the pharmacovigilance system and then adapt the system accordingly. And they should also maintain those close links with the manufacturing function. And then lastly, with the UK PSMF, we do expect that any products that you have that are authorised as decentralised manufactured products should be made clear within the annexes of the PSMF. So that's a whistle-stop tour for the authorised products. If we can move on to the next slide, please. So just a quick note about specials and early access to medicines scheme. The introduction of decentralised manufactured products has resulted in the introduction of Regulation 170A and 170B within the Human Medicines Regulation, which specifically affects specials. And that specifies that the holder must not just submit serious ADRs, which is the current requirement, but also must submit non-serious ADRs to the MHRA for decentralised manufactured specials. And these also must include the batch number. So again, processes must be in place to be able to collect that information and follow up if the batch number is not reported, and then to be able to report that information to the MHRA if it meets reporting requirements. And in addition, the HMR does state that a risk management plan for decentralised manufactured specials may be required. And given the nature of these type of products and that they are going to be novel, the likelihood is that a risk management plan probably will be required for these products. And then early access to medicine scheme, Regulation 167G has been updated. And in addition, again, to collecting and reporting adverse drug reactions, again, these medicines have the addition of recording the batch number. And then there are considerations for these type of medicines, EAMS, to have a risk management plan, and they need to have PSURs reported also, and they will follow the same requirements and points to consider as with the authorised products. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to finish with a thank you to those who joined the workshop from the PV sphere and your input into the guidance and for the comments that you gave us. We have made a couple of amendments to the guidance you would have seen there. Firstly, we've amalgamated all of the guidance for pharmacovigilance, so instead of having 3 separate guidance documents, we have just the one guidance document now which covers authorised medicines, specials and EAMS. We've added paragraph into the quality management section of the authorised medicines section to clarify around deviations. There was some comments around that and when they should be further looked at across sites. And then we've also added additional guidance to the specials sections, there was some confusion around that, but we've aligned the wording within that document to be the same wording that's in guidance note 14 on specials. So hopefully that is now aligned across all of our guidance for specials. So that just leaves me to say thank you very much. There is much more guidance within the document, so please do have a read of that. And that was a very high level summary in a short amount of time, but I'm going to pass on to Kolvinder now, who will talk about CTA and MAA submissions.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Claire, and good afternoon, everybody. So I'm going to talk for a few minutes about the guidance detailing the quality dossier requirements for CTA and MAA submissions. In line with what you might have heard from an earlier colleague, some of this information is common to what we've shared before, and it's a bit of new information about what we've changed since the workshop. But it's a good place to start to say that the general quality dossier requirements for decentralised manufactured products remain aligned with the common technical document requirements. It is, however, expected that some CTAs will require additional development information in the IMPD compared to what you would normally expect to see for a conventionally manufactured IMP. That's commensurate with the risk involved in this sort of manufacturing approach. The additional information that would be required will vary from case to case, but in general terms, companies should address any risks inherent to the dosage form or its intended route of administration, any complexities that may arise from the product's design or its manufacturing process or its manufacturing environment, any variabilities that might be present in the drug substance batches or the finished product batches. So starting to think about these aspects and address them during early development is really key. Similar information will be required through the clinical development program and eventually for MAA. So yeah, good to get started early on that one. We would encourage enhanced development approaches and their associated control strategies. Other established guidance documents remain valid and relevant. So the decentralised manufacture guidance does therefore cross-refer to these. So I'm thinking of guidance on process validation, real-time release testing, QBD, process analytical technology, etc. They all still remain valid and they are applicable. Thank you. If I could have the next slide, please. So thank you to the many stakeholders and colleagues who kindly provided comments on the draft guidance that we had produced. All comments were considered. Some of those comments which were included in the final guidance are detailed here. So firstly, we added clarification for CTAs with where only some of the IMPs met the legal test for decentralised manufacture. This is a CTA unique issue. It's not something I expect to happen in an MAA, but where in a CTA you have multiple IMPs, and if one of those IMPs does not meet the relevant legal test for decentralised manufacture, we would expect a conventional manufacturing process to be used for that IMP, and in most cases would expect that to apply to placebo IMPs. We also added clarification about expectations for characterization and process validation information in CTAs, whereas this should always cover quality critical aspects. The extent of information submitted may be commensurate with the phase of development. And finally, we've moved the labelling guidance for MAA and CTA into a single discrete labelling section for clarity. Okay, thank you very much.
Hopefully, yes. So you've seen this slide before, but just in summary, so we're now at the stage where the SI has been laid, it's signed into law, and next slide, please. It'll be coming into effect soon. So ahead of that, we have this webinar. We've created the new collection site, the hub for information, which, as you heard, will be updating as we continue our journey. And the next slide, please. Next click. Thank you. So the SI comes into effect in July. So hopefully this guidance and will help you to consider whether you wish to engage with us on this, and either for a new application or a variation to an existing application to be manufactured by by the decentralized framework. And the next slide, please. So we look forward to applications, and then based on that, then we'll get some of the real world experiences, and then we'll provide guidance updates to those documents. And the final slide, please. Oh, yes, and as before, we'll continue to engage absolutely with all the innovators, organizations, and other regulators, so that we maintain an alignment of expectations across all the different different countries that will be bringing their own version of decentralized manufacturing into play. And the next slide, please. Thank you. Another click. Thank you. Yes, so just to summarize, so what we've been talking about primarily is the regulatory readiness. I tend to think of this as three pillars. So there's a regulatory pillar. So we have the legislation in place. We've put at least version 1 of the technical and procedural guidance documents in place. From a regulatory perspective, we're working with others on institutional readiness in the UK, say the NHS and other regulators, and also working with international regulators, as mentioned. A lot of the questions that we raised then talk to the technical readiness in large part of the products and the processes and the challenges that, I'm not saying this is going to be easy. I'm sure if it was, it would have been done years ago, but so please engage with us on your technical readiness of your products and processes. And the next click, please. So what you should do now, have a look at that legislation. My colleague David Olszowka has put an overview document, which is on the collection hub, which starts to give a kind of a level of interpretation by picking out elements of the legislation, look at the technical and procedural guidance documents, and see how these can be applied to your products and processes. And next click, please. So please continue to engage with us. So there's some early stage engagements, there's mechanisms already there through the Innovation Accelerator. My colleague Elspeth explained about the designation process. So please then, that will be the next stage, apply for those. That will follow on from some discussions through the Innovation Accelerator. Your product and process may well be candidates for ILAP. This is the innovative license and access pathways, and then through on to scientific advice meetings. This is a journey, I mentioned. It continues. Yes, we've reached some significant milestones, and there's more to come with the legislation coming into effect. But either through that engagement process or separately, where you see there is some issues and challenges that quite likely we haven't spotted, or just maybe updates and corrections to the guidances that we have, please continue to engage with us on that. And we look forward to a successful implementation of this new framework. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jan, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. Once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a survey on the presentation, and we would appreciate if you would complete that and provide your feedback. You will also receive a follow-up email in the coming weeks with a link to view the recording of today's webinar. On behalf of MHRA and our presenters, thank you for joining us today and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you.